We were going to have a baptism today, but something came up and we didn't find out about that until just a few days ago. And so Pastor Adrian Peterson was scheduled to preach today, and when he found out I was scheduled to do the baptism, he said, just cover the pulpit. And so thank you very much, Pastor Peterson, for giving me the opportunity to be able to share with the folk here. But we're going to reschedule the baptism, and hopefully we'll have that here pretty soon. You know, we close out 2016 today. At midnight, it's all going to be in the history books, except if you're Jewish, and that comes at sundown tonight. But we look at 2017. There's a bunch of changes that we're going to go through here in this country and around the world. And we don't know exactly what they'll look like, but God's still in control. And sometimes when we look at scary things in front of us, we look at it and think, oh my, you know, this is big and scary. And sometimes one of the best things we can do is look back at what's happened to us in the past and reflect on the way God has led us in the past as we face an uncertain future. The Israelites had been wandering in the desert for 40-some years, and now they were ready to enter the promised land. This was going to be the crowning act as God is delivering his chosen people. And his people were ready to go and take Jericho now, finally, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. They were ready. Joshua was ready. Everybody was ready to go. And the Bible tells us that they had 40,000 warriors, 40,000 people that were equipped for battle. They were ready to go into Canaan, and it was worth fighting for. Canaan was a land that had been promised to them by God. God had promised Abram back in Genesis 12:7 that this land was going to be theirs. Canaan was beautiful. Canaan was some of the choicest real estate that was known to mankind back then. It was one of the most fertile pieces of ground that was there. Canaan connected Africa with what we would know later on as Europe. It had access to the Mediterranean Sea, beautiful fields, beautiful valleys, and we know that the produce that was there was so beautiful, so big, so everything that they cut a cluster of grapes. Remember when the spies went out? They cut a cluster of grapes, and it was so big that they put it on a pole and had 2 men carry it. So this was some choice real estate. But what's even better than that is the land of Canaan is where the story of redemption was going to be written. The city of Jerusalem is in this little chunk of real estate, as well as so is the little town of Bethlehem. You see, the land of Canaan is where all of these prophecies were going to come to pass, right before people's eyes. All of this was going to take place here in the land of Canaan. The Redeemer was going to be born here. He was going to walk here. He was going to give his life here and pay the ransom for humanity. Jesus was going to soak the dirt with his blood, and he was going to shake the ground with his resurrection. All here in the land of Canaan. You see, the book of Joshua isn't necessarily about claiming some real estate for a dislocated nation. The book of Joshua, the land of Canaan, it's about preserving the stage for God's plan of redemption. And Satan's strategy was clear. He had it all figured out. Contaminate the promised land. Preempt the promised child. Destroy God's people, and you destroy God's work. You see, Joshua's battle was not a physical battle. Joshua's battle was a spiritual battle, and so is ours. Sometimes we get caught up when we look at jobs and we look at paychecks, when the most important thing for us is to stay connected with Jesus. And Satan had one item on his agenda back then, and that was to prevent the Israelites from entering the promised land. You know what? Nothing has changed all these thousands of years later. He is still trying to prevent God's people from entering the promised land. And he will stop at nothing to gain that victory. You see, he didn't mind it when the Israelites were out wandering in the wilderness. Didn't mind that at all. But his wrath was kindled when they were ready to take possession of this land. And the same thing is true today. He doesn't mind it when we are out wandering in our own personal wilderness. But he gets really concerned when we get serious about being true sons and daughters of God. He gets concerned when we walk by faith and not fear. He gets concerned when we decide to lean towards grace and not necessarily guilt. He gets concerned when we listen to God's voice and ignore his voice. And back then, when they're getting ready to go into this land here, that was the first time in 5 centuries that God's people would be camping in Canaan. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. How many times they had gazed across that Jordan and looked at that lush land. And some of them, Joshua and Caleb in particular, had been waiting for 40 years. And when God opened those waters of the Jordan, they didn't have to wait to be asked twice if they were ready to cross. If you have your Bibles, I'd like you to open them to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 4, and let's look at verses 11 through 13. Joshua chapter 4. Joshua chapter 4, and we'll start with verse 11. It says, "Then it came to pass, when all the people had completely crossed over, that the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed over in the presence of the people." Verse 12, "And the men of Reuben, the men of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh crossed over armed before the children of Israel, as Moses had spoken to them. About 40,000, prepared for war, crossed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho." Sit there and think about this huge group of people that's going across there. And I imagine that there was a lot of shouting, a lot of whooping, a lot of hollering. And you know what? If God had not stopped them right then and there, they probably would have ran straight to Jericho to do what they needed to do. But God did stop them. Why? I want you to think about this for a second. This miracle has happened. The Jordan opens and the people cross over, and God stops them. Why? I liken it to a scene that's repeated every August or September, somewhere around there, across the United States. First day of school. You know what it's like, particularly when your little ones, it's their very, very first day of school. Not just of the year, but it's their first day of school. You know what it's like. Morning is busy. You make sure that breakfast has been eaten. You make sure that all their little faces have been washed. You make sure that their backpack is full and packed with everything that they need. And you know that the bus is on its way. And the kids are excited. They're excited about being able to head out that door for the first day of school. But mom stops them. Okay? And as she does, she kind of lowers herself down to their eye level. Kind of does one of these things, make sure the collar is right, make sure that the hair is right and everything. And mom talks to the kids eye level. And she says, remember what I've taught you. Remember who you are. remember whose you are. Translated, what that means is, don't embarrass me. Okay? But it's usually that same thing, and it's, remember. Remember what I taught you. Remember who you are. Remember whose you are. Joshua chapter 4. We'll look at verses 1 through 3. And it came to pass, when all the people had completely crossed over the Jordan, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from every tribe, and command them, saying, Take for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood firm. You shall carry them over with you and leave them in the lodging place where you lodge tonight. So Joshua does that. He has 12 men go back into the Jordan, and they each pick up a stone out of the Jordan River, and they do something special with those stones. And as the people watch, they pick up those stones and they return back to the riverbank, and the water returns back to its normal flow. Let's go over to Joshua chapter 4, verses 18 through 24. Joshua 4:18. And it came to pass, when the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet touched the dry land, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Verse 20, and those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. Then he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, When your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What are these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry land. Verse 23, For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So you have a stack of stones, 12 of them. They knew that people were going to look at those stones and say, what is it with these stones? What are these stones? What do these stones mean? Why are they stacked up like this? They knew that there were going to be questions, and when there are questions, there are naturally answers that follow, and this will give you opportunity to reflect on how God has led you in the past. Remember. Remember. Remember what God has done in your life. Remember who you are. Remember whose you are. It's almost like he's encouraging them to write God's accomplishments in a memory book for you. Because there may be a time when you have to look back and remember. He wanted to capture the crossing of that river in their memory forever so they could tell their children and their children's children. And God was basically telling them that before you look forward to Jericho, you have to look backward to the Jordan and what God accomplished for you there. But it isn't always easy, is it? It sounds easy. Sure, it sounds easy. But is it always easy to remember what God has done for you in the past when you're facing what looks to be an insurmountable future? I was reading a story about a very popular Christian author who was facing a deadline from a publisher. He has a conversation with his daughter that went something like this. She says, "Why are you so quiet, Dad?" He said, "Well, I'm worried about meeting a deadline, a book deadline." And she says, well, haven't you written other books before? Well, yes. How many? 15. Have you ever missed a book deadline before? No. So, God has helped you 15 times already. Right, Dad? Yes. He's helped you each time. At that point, there were no more answers from Dad because he knew he had been had. And then she goes on and she says, well, if God has helped you 15 times before, don't you think he's going to help you this time? Translation. Stack some stones. Stack some stones, Dad. Stack some stones so you can remember how God has led you in the past. Because sometimes the future just seems pretty scary. Stack some stones. Create a trophy room in your heart. And every time you have an experience of a victory, put that on your memory shelf. Before you face a challenge, take a real quick tour of God's accomplishments in your life. Take a look. Take a look at all the paychecks that you've received. Take a look at all the mortgage and the rent payments that you've been able to make. Take a look at all the blessings that you've been given. Take a look at all the prayers that have been answered. Take a look at all the positive visits to the doctors that you've had. Take a look at all the safe trips that you've been able to make. Take a look at all the close calls that you've had and you've made it out alive. Imitate the shepherd boy David. You'll recall before he fought Goliath, he remembered something. He remembered how God helped him kill a lion and a bear. He remembered this stuff. He faced the future by revisiting the past and his journey with God. Don't go to Jericho until you've remembered the Jordan. And I can imagine one of the soldiers there must have probably said, okay, the stones have been stacked. This monument has been memorialized. Can we attack now? Not quite. Not quite, you see, because God had one more instruction for them before he sent them into battle. And that is, remember whose you are. I'd like you to turn to Joshua chapter 5, verse 2. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. You see, 600 years ago, God had talked to Abraham, and God told him that circumcision was going to be the sign of the covenant between God and the human race. How do you do that twice? Well, Joshua 5:2 says, do it a second time. You see, there was a problem with God's people. There was a problem with God's children because you take a look at what happened with the Egyptian bondage, you take a look at the wilderness wanderings, and this was a practice that had lapsed, and it was basically no longer done. There's no real puzzle. You see, those Israelites, they were some hard-headed people. They were some headstrong people. They were an obstinate group of people. Good thing that doesn't apply to us today, right? So the Israelites had basically ignored these instructions from God. And God says, you know what? It's time that you stop ignoring me. And it's time that you remember whose you are. Now, for them, they may have been tempted to ignore him yet again, because think of the logistics in this whole thing. This would leave their men convalescing for weeks. It would mean that their wives and their children and their flocks would be unprotected for that period of time. And they knew that the enemy was watching them closely. They were watching every single move that they made. So what better time to attack than this? But you see, God wasn't concerned with their numbers, and God wasn't concerned with their skills. God wanted them to remember whose they are. God's message to the Israelites back then Remember whose you are. And God's message to us is the same thing. Remember whose you are. You are not the person that you used to be. And much the same thing as a baptism where we die to our old self and we are raised as a new person in Jesus. When we become a Christian, when we become a Christ follower, our former self no longer exists. So what does this new self look like? Well, the Bible tells us that you're God's child. The Bible tells us that you are Christ's friend. The Bible tells us that you are a member of Christ's body. It describes us as a saint. It tells us that we have been redeemed and that we have been forgiven of our sins. It tells us that we're complete in Christ. We lack nothing. It says that we are free from condemnation. We are God's co-worker. We are God's workmanship. We are a citizen of heaven. We are adopted into God's family. We are born of God, and the evil one cannot touch us unless we so choose. See, when the devil comes knocking on your door, let Jesus be the one to answer that door. Remember whose you are. You see, Satan knows whose you are. He's just hoping that you don't know whose you are. Tell Satan, I have been bought with a price. I belong to God. Tell him, I have not been given a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Tell him, I cannot be separated from the love of God. Tell him that I can find grace and mercy at the time of need. Tell him, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So what is the secret of survival in enemy territory? Remember, stack some stones. Remember what God has done for you and stay connected to God. Remember whose you are. Israel did. They finally got it. And God protected them. I'd like you to look at Joshua chapter 5, verse 1. It says, So it was when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we had crossed over, that their heart melted. And there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. Don't face Satan by facing Satan. Face Satan by facing God. Glance at the devil, but gaze upon Jesus because he already fought the battle and he won it. Yes, there is a war out there, but that war has already been won. Satan is a fallen angel and he knows that his time is short. Don't allow him time to mess around with you. Remember what God has done for you. Remember who you are. And remember whose you are. Stack some stones. Go ahead and look toward the Jordan and be ready for Jericho. Thank you.